Get the Angel Reese special at McDonald's now. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. Sound good? Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
Your data is like gold to hackers, and they'll sell it to the highest bidder. Are you protected? McAfee helps shield you, blocking suspicious texts, malicious emails, and fraudulent websites. McAfee Secure VPN lets you browse safely, and its AI-powered text scam detector spots threats instantly. You'll also get up to $2 million of award-winning antivirus and identity theft protection, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Since the January 19th ceasefire began, week after week, Israelis have been sharing these videos of hostages coming home. There are hostages blowing kisses to onlookers, making those hard hands, running to hug their parents and loved ones. But Yair Rosenberg, over at The Atlantic, he says getting hostages to these emotional reunions, it's involved a grim routine.
In the case of Hamas releasing Israeli prisoners, they've been doing a sort of macabre public humiliation rituals involving the hostages. And they put these hostages on stage, and they often make them perform in different ways. They instructed one hostage to kiss his captor, right, for the cameras. They had one hostage speak about looking forward to being reunited with his family when Hamas knows full well that they'd killed his family on October 7th. He just didn't know.
My understanding is that Israelis, too, have put some Palestinian prisoners in T-shirts with Stars of David, things like that, too. So...
Yeah, so in response, after weeks of this stuff, the Israeli prison service released one tranche of the prisoners with T-shirts that said something like "We will never forget," a message sending back to wherever they were sending these prisoners.
It's a small miracle that this ceasefire has held for 6 whole weeks. In theory, these tense exchanges are only the first phase. Phase 2 involves Israel and Hamas hammering out what a permanent agreement could look like. It's supposed to begin this weekend. But given how brittle things have been, nothing's guaranteed.
There's been a lot of uncertainty whether they'd ever make it to phase 2, because there are a tremendous number of interests militating against basically fully ending this war. These are populations that really, really despise each other and have experienced tremendous trauma at each other's hands. And so in some sense, this is to be expected. And there will be that in Israel, and there will be that in Gaza, right? You have all of these Gazans who have been returning to North Gaza and discovering that their homes and their neighborhoods are completely destroyed.
Yeah, one of our producers has spent the last few weeks talking to a Palestinian woman who lives in Gaza.
Hey, Asma.
Oh, Elena. Oh, yeah.
And she's made her way north back to find her home. And in their phone calls, this woman, her name is Asma, she just sounds defeated. She almost can't express how defeated she is. She talks about everything is gray.
Right now, it's just gray. Just gray. Everything is gray.
And she used to have this closet full of clothes that they were all really colorful, and everything's just gone. It's smashed. It's like a layer is how she describes her house. It's just a layer. And she's doing the best she can. She talks about how she's wearing, on one phone call, she was making sure to wear a bright blue outfit because she wanted to be this kind of beacon for the world around her.
So I told my mother, if the city is very gray and very pale and it's not colorful anymore, we have to be colorful. We have to be the color of the city. If dust is everywhere, if it's gray completely, we have to be the color of the city.
And it seemed like a really hopeful act, but also so small,
Yeah, I mean, the words that Donald Trump has repeatedly used to describe Gaza, and particularly northern Gaza, is a demolition site. And he's right. And if they don't get to a phase 2 and the war resumes, it's not clear how they can rebuild anything either.
Today on the show, the Gaza ceasefire moves from phase 1 to phase 2. Maybe. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's smart to always have a few financial goals. And here's a really smart one you can set. Earning cash back on what you buy every day. With Discover, you can. Get this. Discover automatically matches all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year. Seriously, all of it. Discover trusts you to make smart decisions. After all, you listen to this podcast. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
When you check out at the pharmacy, you see the journey from idea to medicine, thanks to our intellectual property system, or IP for short. IP safeguards inventions, like a new way to prevent seizures or lower cholesterol. And IP supports competition from other brands, then lower cost generics, which are 90% of prescriptions filled in the US. Innovation, competition, lower costs, thanks to IP. Learn more at phrma.org/IP-works-wonders.
So a ceasefire started on January 19th, like right before Donald Trump took office here in the U.S. And this was after months of on and off negotiations, stops, starts. What exactly were the terms of the deal that Israel and Hamas eventually did agree to?
It's a very long agreement with many annexes, not all of which are public. The sort of fulcrum of the deal is the exchange of Israeli hostages, some living, some dead, for hundreds and ultimately thousands of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails.
It's so interesting that some of the deal is secret still.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing where you have all of these, details that the negotiators hammer out, and some of it is convenient to put out publicly, but others you don't want to put out publicly because politicians don't always want everyone else to know the compromises they agreed to. Or the diplomats wanted to have ambiguous language that could be interpreted one way or the other so both sides could say yes to it, right? But putting it under too much scrutiny would create problems, right? So there's always elements of these things that become public and elements that are not for various political and diplomatic reasons. And so you have this fulcrum, though, of the exchange, right? And then, of course, you have Israel progressively withdrawing from its positions in Gaza. And earlier this month, they did the most consequential withdrawal, which is they withdrew from what is called the Netzarim corridor, which is this area that bisects the Gaza Strip.
They basically cut the Gaza Strip in half. So it's like if you're going from south to north, you would have to cross through an Israeli military space.
Exactly. And Israel, had built very extensive infrastructure and bases there precisely because it is so strategic. And if you wanted to temporarily or long-term occupy Gaza, you have to hold this area. Also, if you were the Israeli far right and wanted to settle northern Gaza, you'd want to cut it off from the rest of Gaza, right? So there were ultimately multiple ways that could have gone. And Israel's now out of that area, and all of those bases are gone. And so that was a big, result of the ceasefire, and Israel's been progressively withdrawing from more and more of these sorts of positions in Gaza. And humanitarian aid is surging in, at exponentially higher levels than it was during the conflict.
So it seems like this first phase has gone smoothly in its way. Like we've had
in its way
dozens of hostages released to Israel. We've had more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners released. Is that right?
Yes. And I do think the fundamental, fulcrum of the ceasefire has been successful. And even though there have been hiccups, there have been delays on both sides releasing their people, one side or the other. Hamas has fired some rockets. There have been individual skirmishes inside Gaza when people approach Israeli positions. But the two armies have stood down, right? Humanitarian aid has come in and people have been traded across the border, right? And I think fundamentally I can look at that as a success. Phase 2 is a much more complex and bigger lift, which is why they've now started talking about extending phase 1 and saying, well, maybe it's too much to ask people to go to phase 2 and some of the commitments in phase 2. Maybe we can come up with a way to keep the system going in phase 1 sort of indefinitely.
Can we talk about where this ceasefire began to fray? As we've said, it's held up, but there have also been these moments where it's just clear how tenuous this all is. And especially in the last couple of weeks, Because, when we first reported there's going to be a ceasefire in Gaza, the guest who we had on, one of the first things he said was you're going to need to keep an eye on what happens with the Bibas family, who at the time I had not heard of. I did not know of them, even though I think in Israel they were, everyone knew the Bibas family. So can you just explain why this family became so important and how it happened with them is emblematic of how this agreement has begun to fray at the edges?
Yeah. So the Bibas family became something of a symbol of October 7th for a bunch of reasons. One, it's that they were a multi-generational family that was effectively wiped out by October 7th. On October 7th, the grandparents of this family were killed. And then the father, Yardain Bibas, the mother, Shiri Bibas, and the children, Ariel, age 4 at the time, and Kfir, age 9 months, were all taken to Gaza. Now, they weren't taken together, meaning the husband, I believe, was taken separately from the mother and children, which will become important. And so you have this mother and her 2 redheaded children captured on video sort of being, hustled into Gaza. And it becomes this iconic image that airs on international news and, of course, is seen all over Israel. And the fate of these people becomes, a big part of the national consciousness and the national effort to bring back the hostages.
Did anyone know what had happened with this family?
So already in November, if you recall, there was this initial ceasefire.
A year ago, November.
Yes, November 2023. This is right after October 7th. Remember, they have this early ceasefire where Hamas releases, in exchange for prisoners from Israel, sort of the elderly, the infirm, and children that it can release. The people it was kind of embarrassing that they took in the first place. And conspicuously, they did not release Shiri Bibas and her kids. Right? So this is not long after October 7th, and it doesn't seem like they're able to give them back. Hamas puts out a story that they've been killed in an airstrike that Israel did. It provides no evidence that this is the case. It doesn't show any images. It doesn't, it just says so. And so they become this symbol of October 7th. And then this past week, Hamas says, we have the bodies of Shiri and her children. Earlier, they'd released Yardain because he was held by Hamas, but Shiri and her children were held by a smaller armed group initially. And so they were separated, and it seems they did not survive. And so this past Thursday, in a public celebratory ceremony, they paraded 4 coffins, the mother, the 2 children, and an 80-something-year-old peace activist named Odette Lifshitz, also deceased, right? These 4 hostages, and they send them to Israel. Now, that entire ceremony was obviously very enraging. It was condemned by the UN Secretary General. The coffins had pictures of the kids and then pictures of the mom, and the mom's coffin said that she had been, quote, arrested on October 7th.
Oh.
And so there was all sorts of strange and disturbing, sort of stagecraft surrounding it. But it was sort of dwarfed by what happened afterwards, which is that the bodies are transferred to Israel. They go to the forensics examiners, and the forensic examiners confirmed 2 things. One, that the boys were not killed in an airstrike, as Hamas has said, but they were killed in some other way. And 2, the mother's body wasn't the mother's body at all. Hamas had sent back a Palestinian woman, and they couldn't identify who it was.
That must have just set people off inside Israel.
Yeah, this causes obviously a dramatic uproar. Now, what I would say is I don't think Hamas did it on purpose, and Hamas claimed it was a mix-up, and the next day they quietly transferred over the correct body. But that provides more evidence that Hamas did not have control of these hostages. I didn't actually really know what happened to them. And it's important context for this that one of the hostages that was released earlier in the ceasefire, a 20-year-old soldier named Daniela Gaboa, she said that she was forced to film a video of her being killed in an airstrike where she put on powder and debris, and they made her pose as though she'd been murdered in an airstrike.
Well, why is that important here?
Because that is also the same story that Hamas would also put out about the Bibas family. And so you should always be skeptical of both sides and their propaganda, but it is the case that we know that Hamas has lied about this sort of thing before.
All of this is just so horrifying. Like to be able to just to even, if we can pause and just say a hostage was forced to like stage her own death for a camera.
There is a lot of this sort of thing that we're only just learning about as the hostages come out. Because now they can tell us what they experienced in Gaza, and so you start learning about the different kinds of abuses they endured. And, that only happens, right, once people get out. It's also the case that, right, Palestinian prisoners are being released and also telling stories about how they were abused, right, and testifying to abuse in Israeli prisons. It's important to understand that's also happening.
Well, I'm glad you added that Palestinian prisoners are also talking about the abuse that they were put through, because it speaks to why getting to phase 2 of this ceasefire was always a very difficult ask. Everyone on both sides is very angry and feels abused, frankly.
Yeah. And I think that that's not sometimes fully appreciated by well-meaning outsiders who come into the conflict and think, if only we just came up with the right formulas and words, that everyone could just get along. Because that wasn't true before October 7th and certainly after October 7th and the war. These are two traumatized communities who frankly would like nothing to do with each other but are still living on the same land with each other. And that's a really difficult problem to solve.
After the break, where do phase 2 negotiations stand now?
This episode is brought to you by PDS Debt. Struggling with credit cards, personal loans, medical bills, or collections? It's time to stop worrying about that high-interest debt you've got piling up. PDS Debt can help you start saving money immediately. Their platform can analyze your unique situation and create a plan to get you out of debt. There's no minimum credit score required, and it takes 30 seconds to get your results. With PDS Debt, you'll take back control of your finances. Get a free debt analysis in just 30 seconds at pdsdebt.com/Spotify.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
So we're approaching this deadline. It feels like no one is quite prepared for it. Has there even been real negotiating happening? And between whom? And what are the sticking points?
There are conflicting reports as to whether there's been serious negotiations about moving into phase 2. There were supposed to be, according to the ceasefire agreement, there actually were already supposed to be negotiations about moving to phase 2. At different times, there have been leaks saying that Israel's been negotiating that, and then Netanyahu's people will come out and say, no, we're not negotiating that. But Netanyahu's people would say that because they want to keep his coalition in line. So you never know who's actually telling the truth. What is the case is that Trump is sending his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, to the region this week to try to negotiate either the transition to phase 2 or the extension of phase 1.
As best you can tell, does Israel want to restart hostilities if somehow the truce lapses?
It's very hard to know what's going on in Netanyahu's head, especially because he's always bobbing and weaving and changing his position based on what will keep him in power and what will allow him to survive for another day. My guess is that he would be comfortable with a sort of situation where you have a ceasefire, which covers the two armies, but there's still low-grade violence where Israel is does a raid here or a raid there and goes after these Hamas people there, these Hamas people there, but there isn't this full-scale war. Whereas his far-right partners would like the full-scale war to get back on. In fact, they'd like to cut off all humanitarian aid, and then they'd like to start clearing parts of Gaza and settling it. So I don't think that's what Netanyahu would like to do. I don't know what Trump actually wants him to do. Because Trump has sort of these different positions that don't seem to align with anybody else's.
So if the two sides don't reach an agreement to move forward with phase 2, what happens on Sunday?
It's very hard to know. What does this conflict look like now? Is it, individual skirmishes where Israel sees a Hamas cell and goes after them? Or is it just full scale, everything resumes? All the tanks roll in, Israel rebuilds all the bases that it took down, and we start all over again. I have a hard time believing that that's going to happen, just because it does seem like the various international actors are working very hard to sort of extend at least phase one. But it's certainly a real possibility if everything really breaks down.
At the same time that there's this negotiation and exchange of prisoners happening in Gaza, there's also a whole lot of action in the West Bank. And I think it's worth us talking about that because that's another Palestinian territory. And Israel's been running a counterterrorism operation there for more than a month now. It's displaced tens of thousands of Palestinians from their homes. What's going on there?
This is one of those stories that gets overlooked amidst so many other international headlines and the Gaza war itself. But for the last few years, dating back to some conversations we've had on this show, the sort of security infrastructure of the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority has been collapsing. The Palestinian Authority is the entity that controls parts of the West Bank, has its own security forces, coordinates with Israel, and administers the West Bank. But it's run by a sort of dictatorial character who was elected and then never left office, and lacks popular legitimacy and is extremely old, and is seen as corrupt. And as he is aged and, the Palestinian Authority has decayed, a lot of other armed groups have entered the vacuum, and many of them have explicitly oriented themselves against Israel and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And so you have this situation where the Palestinian Authority doesn't really control large swaths of the West Bank as it once did, and so now Israel is fighting directly with these different armed groups. And that's been happening for years. Israel accelerated its counterterrorism operations during the Gaza war, and then it particularly did so after Trump was elected, which I don't think is a coincidence. Presumably the Biden administration was restraining Israel in various ways, and as soon as Trump was elected, Israel understood that they would have a freer hand to do these sorts of operations in the West Bank and not get criticism from the administration for how they did them.
This is the first time Israeli tanks have entered the West Bank in decades, right? It's an aggressive move, what's happening here.
Yes. Although I would say that there were several aggressive moves that, just don't register because people weren't focusing on them, right? Israel has been, engaging in drone strikes against different militant groups and cells, and that's a tremendous escalation, and that has been going on for some time. The tanks are just something visual that people can point to, but this has been a low-grade war that has been happening, but because it's not the full-scale war that was happening in Gaza, it was not receiving the attention it might otherwise have gotten.
These militarized groups in the West Bank are fighting back, right? 3 empty buses in central Israel exploded last Thursday in what officials have said was a terrorist attack. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so there's a tremendous amount we don't know about that. In general, there have been a series of terrorist attacks that have originated in the West Bank, which then serve as justifications for the counterterrorism operations in the West Bank, and you have this, constant cycle. The most recent one of these attacks, which may have been an attack, but we don't really have the details yet, but was rather spectacular, was that this past week, a whole bunch of buses blew up. Several buses blew up, and they were empty because it was in the evening. And then multiple other explosive devices were discovered on buses. And reportedly, at least one of them had some sort of message, with sort of regards from this particular place in the West Bank. But they're still investigating. They haven't arrested the prime suspects for any of it. And although there have been leaks from, security sources saying that they are treating this as an attack from the West Bank that was meant to be sort of mass casualty, it would have been as big or the biggest attack since October 7th, right? It would have been mass murder of a large number of civilians if these bombs were meant to go off when people were on the buses.
Which they did not.
But they didn't, right? And that's a big question, right? So is it the case that the bombs just went off early? And that has happened with other bombing attacks before. That isn't unprecedented. Or was it attempted to be sort of a warning, right? And blow things up but not kill people? Or, there's a very small chance that it was gang violence and it had nothing to do with this conflict, and maybe someone wanted to dress it up as being part of the conflict for deniability. The point is, we don't have any of the details because they're still investigating it. Tremendous number of rumors swirling, very little facts.
Yeah.
But it could become a huge ticking time bomb if they do get the suspects and it turns out that this was a big orchestrated plot and it was meant to be a huge mass casualty civilian attack, right? Well, then you have to find out who those people were. That is going to lead to further counterterrorism operations in the West Bank.
Yeah. I was really struck by something that Benny Gantz, the former Israeli defense minister, said about the bus bombings. He said the event should be treated like a mega attack. We must not look at the outcome, but at the intent. And it seems to me like that distinction between outcome and intent, it's just what so much of the controversy surrounding this conflict is about. Like, Israelis are focusing on the intent of Hamas. They intended to kill Jews on October 7th, so the campaign in Gaza is justified. Terrorists in the West Bank wanted to bomb Israelis, so tanks in the West Bank are necessary now too. But if you focus on outcome, what you see is a tragedy of 1,200 Israeli deaths and nearly 50,000 dead Palestinians. I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, I do think that fundamentally Israel sees itself as justified because it looks at what were the intentions of the people who attacked us, not just the outcomes, which is to say that if Hamas, for example, on October 7th had Israeli-level weaponry, how many Israelis would have been dead, right? How many civilians would be dead? And they say we should treat it that way, and that is how Hamas should be understood, right? These buses blew up. Again, we don't really know exactly what, but it's presumed, like as Gantz is assuming in that quote, that the intention was to kill hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians in the morning on the buses, right? The fact that they didn't actually get killed because of some freakish accident or, happenstance of fate doesn't change the fact that people who did this wanted to do that. Right. And if they were given the means and opportunity, and if they are allowed to flourish or just left alone, they will find ways to do it. And therefore, Israel's actions are justified in going after them, including very extreme measures. And then critics of Israel look and say, but look at what has actually happened. Look at the results of the things that you are doing. And the ledger is very lopsided. And I think that, in fact, if you're talking to, people who have very different strong stances on this conflict, you will realize that that is actually the debate they're having. Fundamentally, they're just having different conversations. Right. And their moral frame is different because it depends what you're looking at.
How do you negotiate when that's the gap between your framing of what's happening is so wide?
I think the hard thing to understand is that both of them are right. Right. The outcome of the Gaza war as experienced by the Gazans, as we've discussed, right, the utter destruction of entire swaths of Gaza, the devastation of entire homes and neighborhoods. And then, of course, the massive death toll. It happened. But it's also the case that Hamas, as we've seen from these, macabre ceremonies that they've been doing, with Israeli hostages dead and alive, as we saw on October 7th when they filmed their atrocities and they executed a grandmother in her home and then uploaded the video to her Facebook page, right? So the intentions really matter, and so do the outcomes, and all these things are true. And this is why it's proven so difficult diplomatically, because diplomats might come in and be able to explain that in nice, and thoughtful language. But as people have actually experienced the conflict, it doesn't really cut it for them.
Yair, I'm really grateful for your time and your analysis. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Yair Rosenberg is a staff writer over at The Atlantic and the author of Deep Shtetl, a newsletter about the intersection of politics, culture, and religion. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Madeline Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. You can go track me down on Blue Sky. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.